people still trickling in and the attendees. Let's go ahead and kick it off, and I'll try to post that message to send people to the Q&A every 15 or 20 minutes, so the newcomers don't forget about that. But let's go ahead and kick it off. You ready? Cool. So hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this Saturday afternoon during Shelter in Place. My name is Ernest Brown. I am several things relevant to this conversation. I'm the board chair at EBHO Action, one of our panelists from there. I'm the co-executive director, which is a volunteer position at East Bay for Everyone, another housing advocacy organization. I'm on the board of the East Bay Young Democrats. I'm a member of Tech Equity Collaborative, through East Bay for Everyone, a member of East Bay Housing Organizations, and I am not yet an investor owner in the East Bay Rental Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, but I have been to several meetings. All of that to say is, I think a lot both of the organizations represented here, but also the particular leaders we have represented here. And I'm, for one, really excited to finally participate in a conversation about housing here in the Bay Area with like no white dudes. So let's see how that goes, and if that changes the dynamic in a meaningful way. But what I wanted to kind of gather us here to talk about some is there are a lot of visions or a lot of diagnoses of what's wrong with housing here in the Bay Area. It's too expensive. It's unaffordable for so many different kinds of people. People are pushing further and further out away from where the jobs are. And people are really trying to put out a lot of policy solutions, which, you know, we could talk about those for a long time, but there are actually organizations on the ground trying to bring justice or something like a closer into division and trying to make that a real thing. And I think we have here 4 organizations and 4 leaders that really embody that. And I want to have a conversation with them, but yes, we'll touch on sort of what specific policy solutions should we be trying to enact more or less of, but also what does it mean and what does it take to actually move us closer to those? Because no matter what policy solution you hear kind of espoused today, it's probably been on the table for at least 2 decades, at least. But like, why hasn't it happened? And what are the people we have here doing to make sure that the next 2 decades they get closer rather than further away? So yes, we're going to talk about policy today, so please ask those questions in the Q&A. But I also really want to try to think really hard about why haven't those policies been enacted yet? What are the barriers? And what can we be doing collectively, and again, through these organizations, to kind of bring that closer into focus? So that's what I want to kind of like us to think about today. So with that, can we do some quick introductions of the other panelists? And then we're going to learn a bit more about what each of them is doing, how those works differ, and hopefully how they sort of interrelate and could work together more as we move forward. I'm going to call your name just in order that I see you on my screen, so y'all can go without the whole pause thing. Let's do Laura, Gloria, Noni, Catherine.
Hi, my name is Laura Foote. I'm the executive director of EBHO Action. EBHO, obviously, yes, in my backyard. We are a pro-housing advocacy organization that does a lot of work advocating for all kinds of housing and trying to focus the conversation on saying that there are communities that have been blocking housing for now a full generation and more. And the history of that is complicated and often based on racial exclusion, and saying we need to have communities that are more welcoming for everyone. We need to have integrated communities, and we have to adapt our policies to say that, you know, there's one benefit, which is that the housing crisis is now hitting an ever expanding group of people, and it gives us a real opportunity to change that permanently. But if we don't do it equitably, we're going to really miss the opportunity here to right these long-term wrongs. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have here today.
Great, thanks, Laura, and thanks, Ernest, for pulling this together and having us all. I'm really excited to be speaking with these fabulous women and bringing together these views. I also just have to give a shout out, just because I've gotten a couple of compliments on the virtual background, which, by the way, is an affordable housing property in Oakland called Casa Arabella, right next to the Fruitvale BART. Our communications manager, Grover Wayman Brown, is on the webinar. She did this, not me. So thanks, Grover. And it's in honor of our Affordable Housing Week. I'm with EBHO, East Bay Housing Organizations. We're a membership organization, as Ernest mentioned, and our membership represents people who provide affordable housing, people who live in affordable housing, and basically just anybody in East Bay who cares about folks having an affordable, quality, stable place to live. We welcome you as an organization or an individual member. Been around for over 35 years doing advocacy and organizing to create, preserve, and protect affordable housing in the East Bay. And I'm going to talk more about what we focus on and what our philosophies are when we circle back.
Hi, thanks for having me here today, Ernest and Gloria. My name is Noni Session. I am the Executive Director of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. We're a relatively young organization. We're about 3 years old, and we're piloting a unique model of collective community financing of land and housing, where we support frontline communities, that is most frequently Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities who have been excluded from permanent access to affordable land and housing. We support them in organizing, locating, financing, and long-term asset managing land and housing together collectively, cooperatively, non-violently, and we look to use that asset building to build ownership and wealth among those who have the least access to long-term stability.
Hey everyone, I'm Catherine Gracie, founder and executive director of the Tech Equity Collaborative. We believe that the Bay Area and California's tech-driven economy can and should be creating broad-based opportunity for everybody, rather than driving displacement and inequality. And we mobilized tech workers around an advocacy agenda that will help us realize that mission. We obviously think that housing is the critical component to creating a future economy that is inclusive, and one where when the pie grows, everybody can kind of benefit from that. And I'm looking forward to talking about the role that tech can play in being a part of the solution, and how we can both grow how a growing economy is not the enemy of progress, but should be a critical component of progress.
Thank you, Catherine. So when the panelists and I were talking about kind of setting this up, one thing I offer to do is just to sort of state some, again, facts that if you live in the Bay Area and have for a while, you probably have heard some of this, but if you're newish to the housing conversation, so I'm going to kind of say some like ground rule observations of what's going on in housing. And then we're going to kind of get into what's the assessment each of these organizations kind of taking about why is it that way and what should we be doing kind of with those facts taken. So I'm going to try not to get too in the weeds here, but just some basic principles. Rents and house prices are very high in the Bay Area. Home prices can exceed at an average of $1 million in several of the Bay Area counties. According to SPUR, the San Francisco Planning Urban Research Institute, the Bay Area is missing about 1 million homes that should have been built since 2000. So at least some of the problem is being driven by, we are adding jobs, we are adding people, but we are not adding homes. And of course, the burden of this is falling heaviest on those with the lowest income. According to the MTC, more than half of people who have incomes around 200% of the poverty line are spending more than 50% of their income on rent. And of course, you can only imagine how it's being exacerbated by crises like the one we're experiencing now. But at some level, this isn't just a Bay Area story. There's nowhere in America where a family on a minimum wage income can afford the median price house. So we're experiencing a somewhat acute version of this American housing affordability story here, but it's a nationwide problem at some level. And to kind of just highlight the fact that Bay Area is both an outlier of this, 40% of households making around the median income are still spending more than 1/3 of their income on housing. So even folks who are doing, are average by the Bay Area standards, are still spending far above what they should be spending on housing to have safe, affordable housing. So there's something really wrong here. And of course, numbers get worse as you break them down by race. But we want to kind of set that out. So what we were hoping to do is kind of just go kind of panelist by panelist, sort of laying out what is the assessment your sort of organization makes of like, why is this the case? And kind of what should we be doing to sort of move forward on this? To kind of go in a different order from last time, let's go Catherine, Noni, Gloria, Laura.
Oh God, I'm on the spot. Okay, so I was just actually gonna drop our Tech Equities housing platform and sort of values statement into the chat. I'll do that after I'm done. Gloria, I should point out, is one of our housing advisors, so helped us write that. When I started Tech Equity, I was not, my background is in civic tech, and so I really didn't know anything about housing policy, but I live across the street from the building that Square now occupies, or would occupy if anybody was working in it right now. and that a few years ago, Uber actually bought. And the reaction to that was very negative from my neighbors in the community. And it just kind of struck me at that point that something was very broken in our economy when, you know, the most valuable privately held company in the world could announce they're bringing thousands of good jobs to a place where the median income is $25,000 a year, and that the community would not see value in that. And it didn't strike me as an irrational position, but I also, you know, didn't really understand enough about the local kind of economic dynamics to understand what was behind it. And so I decided to start digging into it, and it became pretty clear pretty quickly as I was thinking about how we could grow the tech economy in a place like Oakland that, you know, no one would argue doesn't need the tax base, in a way that people would see value in. We couldn't do that without solving the housing crisis. And so I kind of jumped headfirst into housing and naively thought, what I thought was naively at the time, and this was late 2016, there seemed to be a lot more common ground between the sort of, you know, what I saw as like kind of the two factions of the housing conversation at that time, which were sort of the production, early YIMBY days, and the kind of traditional anti-displacement tenant advocacy community. And it seemed like there should be more of a common agenda there than was playing out in public discourse. And I thought that maybe we could, given that part of what we were trying to do is build bridges between the tech community and everybody else. And because there's a lot of overlap between who is naturally in our base, tech workers, and who falls naturally into YIMBY's base, I thought there might be an opportunity for us to kind of stake out some common ground. And it turns out, and I'd be interested to hear what all the other panelists say about this, there is actually a lot of common ground. And to your first question, Ernest, about, you know, what do we need? We already know what the policy proposals are. How do we actually get to them, and make sure that they're equitable? I think a lot of that is politics and, you know, finding that common agenda where people who care about, you know, tenant advocacy and not displacing communities of color at the cost of building new housing, can all kind of be on the same page and fight for a common agenda. So that's kind of that's sort of the broad where tech equity is. And if folks want to poke around in our agenda, you know, more deeply, they can. I don't know that I have like a unified theory for how we got here. The more I read, the more complicated it becomes, but I'm really, you know, I think it's obviously really important to focus on the racialized aspect and for everybody to understand that, you know, how we are here and why the housing crisis affects Black and brown people more than it does other communities was intentional. And so we need to be very intentional about how we get out of that as well.
Thanks for that. I am a third generation West Oakland native. I've left my home several times to live abroad and in other states and look at other community dynamics. And our current work around community investment and land and housing, we ask other questions besides for the diversion of capital from extractive markets, right? We're trying to ask a question of what does it take to build an inclusive community that begins with keeping legacy Oaklanders rooted? But this question of building is a bit deceptive. And I'll come back to that in terms of the 3 Ps, preservation, protection, and production. I'll come back to that in a second. But we'll even start with what I am coming to really understand as a misnomer, the housing crisis, right? There's a better question, a more elaborating question to ask about this thing we're all experiencing together is about access and distribution, right? We move automatically to after preservation, meaning often meaning standing stock, but usually standing stock that's considered to have sort of a deeper intrinsic value, which is a very subjective kind of framework to try to operationalize. And then there's protection, where often we are either relegating it to the folks we sometimes derisively consider the activists, or to small policies that chip around the edges for folks who are renters. And you must know that at Oakland standing population, 60% of Oakland standing population are renters. 80% of our housing stock is small housing stock. Nonetheless, there are 10,000 empty units in the Bay Area, right? And however, we often jump directly to the question of production. How do we produce more? How do we make more space available to newcomers, to displaced, to rent burdened, to homeless? Where do we find the space to build more housing stock? And in the framework of access and distribution, it really skips, in some ways, it really kind of disappears a big segment of our society who hold responsibility in this challenge of access and distribution. These are the property holders who are holding it not simply empty land. We're talking about empty units that are not affordable and have been in no way pressed to give back to the society from whom they've drawn infrastructure support to attain and own those assets. In addition, if we're talking about populations like the tech population, and how do we support those folks who are also economic migrants, who are also under economic pressure, and ironically are now technically the ones who sit right at the threat of low income. The average Black Oaklander's income is about $36,000. The average white Oaklander's income is about $80,000. Low income starts at between $80,000 and $100,000, ironically, right now. So even if we look at the scale of income and the access to the empty units, when even our new coming tech workers often don't have access to these units, another layered condition of inequity is that most of our legacy Oaklanders, most of our Black and brown youth do not have access even to the entry-level tech jobs in order to even compete with the newcomers, right? So we've got all these layers of responsibility that we're not really placing where they belong, and instead chipping around the edges and asking us how as a community we can continue to divvy up a smaller and smaller segment of resources when there is a large chunk of our society who are holding such a voluminous amount of resources and are not being required to share them. Not being required to, the folks who have held space here for 100 years and labored, not pressing ourselves to create a conduit to inclusiveness. So not only would folks with a more equalized income be able to make more demands in the rental market, but also to make demands of folks who are profiting off of our infrastructure that you and I all pay into. So our argument on East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is we need to rethink the conversation. We are not in a housing crisis. We're in a crisis of access and distribution, and a sense of where equity derives from, and how to allow people to share in the resources we do have right now.
Thanks, Noni. Ernest, am I up? All right. Yeah, this is really powerful, and I actually couldn't agree more with your comments about access and distribution, which I'm going to get to in a moment, but also just want to pick up on what Catherine said about her attempts and tech equity attempts to figure out what the common ground is. And I just want to highlight that for a second, because I recognize some of the names in the attendee list, which I understand you all can't see, and there's some familiar Housing Walk names and a lot of names I don't know. And some people may or may not realize that having these 5 organizations on a Zoom all together talking about common ground is not an insignificant thing, because we work in different ways, and although we know each other, our networks only partially overlap and do not always get along, to put it mildly. So I'm excited that we are kind of focusing on what are the common things we believe. I believe everybody on this panel right now believes that everybody should have housing. It's a human right. You shouldn't have to be a certain kind of person, a certain kind of worker to deserve a decent place to live or to have choice in where you live. I think everybody on this call, as they've articulated, believes that racism and other forms of exclusion have directly contributed to the types of housing shortages and affordable housing shortages that we have. So I want to just highlight that there are some commonalities. At the same time, there are a lot of differences, and I just want to situate a little bit where EBHO is within this range of how we approach the housing issues and how we got here. You know, I think that a lot of the people that EBHO works with, many of our members, are creators of affordable housing. They build affordable housing with a capital A, capital H, meaning it has some sort of public subsidy involved, and that it's income restricted in terms of who can live there and in terms of the rent. So it's operating differently than the private market. And one of our primary goals in the decades that we've been around has been to produce more of that kind of housing, because we believe that with it being generally nonprofit owned and publicly funded, that it is less prone to discrimination, it's less prone to poor maintenance, it's more likely to be connected to community, to have services, all of those things that you would want to see in building true community and not just buildings. And we've really worked towards that for many years. We've also worked on, as you know, Noni mentioned, the 3 Ps: production, which is building the stuff; protection, which is keeping people in their homes, usually through tenant protections or protections against foreclosure; and preservation, which means keeping what we have either through financial structures or by acquiring and rehabbing older homes and making them both affordable and safer. Those 3 Ps are really important to us. But you know, I will say, historically, our organization is focused mostly on the production piece. And the reason for that is that I think a lot of people got into this work thinking of what now I have to untrain myself from calling it the housing crisis, but for now, thinking of the housing crisis primarily as an issue of affordability. And that sounds obvious, but I'm going to break it down. It's affordability. It's an affordability crisis caused, of course, by specific racist policies, by exclusionary land use that says what kind of home you can build where, it doesn't let you build smaller units, by to some extent by construction costs, which you will hear a lot, and that is a major factor in the Bay Area. Now, I would argue that is not the historical driver of why housing is unaffordable, especially for Black and brown and low income and other vulnerable communities, but it is a factor. And so I think that while it can be demonstrated that there is a shortage region-wide in the Bay Area in terms of the number of homes that have been built region-wide versus the number of jobs that have been created during the boom economy that just crashed, yeah, it's totally out of sync. But it's not just a numbers question, as Noni pointed out. It's about the access and the distribution. Where have those homes been built? What different quality are those homes? Who owns them? What form are they? So there's a terrible shortage of affordable, modest apartments and townhomes in places like Orinda and Lafayette, even though there's no shortage of actual space where people can live, right? So you really have to complicate it with all of those issues. And, you know, I'll just say, to echo what Catherine said, our other theory is that what got us here is that the current housing situation is multifaceted in its roots, it's very clearly racialized, and it is a result of intentional public policy and other practices. It didn't just happen because of the market. Because of that, our responses have to be multi-pronged. They have to be intentional about racial equity and justice, and they can't just leave things to the market alone. And this is the last point that I want to make, is that our organization finds ourselves in a really interesting moment where there's a tussle in the Bay Area between people who are like, let's build affordable, but let's, you know, like Laura's organization or Ernest's organization, let's build affordable, but we also got to build some market rate housing. We got to build it all in incomes to make this work. And people who are like, I'm done with market rate housing. I don't want it anymore. I don't want it, especially in historically impacted communities. It drives more displacement. It's not affordable. You heard those numbers that Noni quoted. EBHO is not on the anti-market rate housing side. And for a long time, I was like, why is this so, not because I don't understand displacement, I'm like, why is this so fraught? Because, you know, in my mind, the issue with market rate housing was initially not that it was market rate, but that market rate is unaffordable. There was a time in California and in many communities where a market, that term didn't exist, right? It's like a landline, we had to reverse engineer that term. A market rate home, there were different points at the market in which somebody who wasn't wealthy could afford housing without subsidy. That is no longer true. And therefore market rate housing becomes a flashpoint because anybody who doesn't make less than 6 figures can't afford something in the market. And so we really look at that affordability question, and like building more is one way, keeping people in their place in their homes is another way, absolutely looking at innovative models is another way. But really though, it's a question of what does market really mean? And then increasingly, what I didn't initially understand, and what I think organizations like Noni's and others are trying to address is, it's actually not just a matter of affordability, it's increasingly a matter of ownership of the housing asset. Because no matter what it costs, if we have increasing corporate mass ownership of forms of housing, then we get into a situation where we have the foreclosure crisis, where people own their homes, but they didn't really, you know, or we get into a situation where people are renting and they thought they're stable, but they're not really. And their landlord doesn't live down the street. Their landlord is Blackstone. They're, you know, and so I think now it's incumbent on the affordable housing industry, which has been doing amazing work to broaden its view and look at affordability solutions, but also at what do we do as nonprofit mission-driven providers who are not part of that corporate speculative world? How can we make sure that we're addressing the ownership issue as well? So those were many ideas, but I just wanted to get some of those out there in terms of what we're starting to think about.
Oh man, so many people said such interesting things, and it's like, you know, it's like you want to pick different things but I'm sure we're gonna have a lot of time to talk. So I'm gonna pull back to kind of Ernest's original question, even though I do just want to bounce off of what everybody's saying. So the YIMBY perspective on kind of like how we got here is very much rooted in the idea that we had deliberately exclusionary policies that explicitly said on paper, Black and brown people cannot live in these neighborhoods. And the way that we see is that then we as a country said by fiat from higher levels of federal government, you now have to have on paper less racist housing policies. But of course, local communities didn't wake up the next day and say, oh, I guess I'm not gonna be racist anymore, right? Like obviously they came up with ways to continue those patterns of exclusion, and that a big part of that was instituting zoning policies that helped them keep especially people of color out of neighborhoods, especially keep any kind of subsidized affordable housing. And the rules got more and more complicated about how to keep people who were different out of the neighborhood. And because they weren't allowed to be explicitly racist, they were implicitly racist and based on the kind of buildings that people were banned from building, and by proxy, the kinds of people who were potentially then banned from coming into those neighborhoods. And the way that the YIMBY movement then sees that rolling out is that distribution and access to neighborhoods problem then generated an overall shortage problem. And so now we have both this access to neighborhoods problem, we have more segregated schools and communities than we've ever had before, and we have chronic housing shortages in places where the economy grew and the housing stock was not able to respond to that. Wasn't able to respond to that also because at the same time as all that was going on, we spent less and less of what we should have been spending on subsidized affordable and all kinds of more supportive housing. It also happened because we were seeing a more of a barbell economy overall. And so there are all these like housing, anytime you start picking at housing, you start touching on every other aspect of people's lives, obviously. But we believe that there's both this shortage problem and this distribution problem. And how do we solve that? And I will say, like, the nice and the terrible thing about YIMBYs is that we're spineless pragmatists. We want to solve the problem, and therefore, you know, we sort of struggle with, okay, which piece do we need to make our peace with in order to solve what we can solve? And so one of the pieces that I think is really important for us to make our peace with is saying that, like, right now, because we need to create so much housing and we really need to focus it on the most exclusionary neighborhoods, we see that in communities where the only housing that was being built over the past kind of 20 or 30 years was focused in communities that couldn't have as much political influence to fight that housing. So the condos that were built in the lowest income and the poorest neighborhoods, and often did mean the destruction of low income housing in order to build, you know, housing for new tech workers. And people's like lived experience of that means that we're going to have to really think carefully about how do we create strong tenants protections, focus new housing construction in the neighborhoods that have been the most exclusionary, and integrate those school districts. And that's a like really complicated, painful, and difficult conversation, especially when so much of the housing advocacy world has been centered on empowering low-income communities to be able to direct what's happening in their communities. And I think this is what's made the politics so difficult, is how do we take the argument to the exclusionary suburbs, and how do we demonstrate to low-income communities of color that we want to go there with you and we want to make these policies work for everyone. I think it's going to be really hard, but I also think that there's a real, like, I look at Catherine Bracy and I say, like, who's going to be helping us build those connections and going to be building that ability to say we're going to build affordable housing in Beverly Hills, because that's, to me, where that's going to be housing justice, is when Cupertino is also building a ton of affordable housing. And so I think I look forward to like having a complicated conversation about getting there.
Thank you all. And now it's time for our complicated conversation, now that we got our kind of opening bets out there. So in our sort of prep session, we talked about a few issues to kind of deep dive on, sort of kind of expand, and thankfully this one kind of came up really clearly in the opening bit, is now, how does the issue of race, and particularly anti-Blackness, sort of show up in the history of housing? We heard a little bit about that from Noni. But now I want you guys to help me and the audience sort of think through, like, what does that look like in like the solution set? Because in like 2000, so like not ancient history, my parents, who I checked are not here, I invited them, but they didn't come, got a predatory mortgage and got a home that was quickly underwater, and only as of like a year ago was it not underwater, and guess what, it's underwater again. And sort of that continues to this day, right? And they're in a position to own a home, you know? And so much of the way the housing system we set up, and I really appreciate your sort of access and distribution framework, Noni, and I'm gonna ask you to kind of help us think through how that gets us forward, in terms of like, we have both an acute shortage of housing, at least in some markets like we do here in the Bay Area, maybe not everywhere else. But then even if we were to resolve the shortage, that would resolve the questions of access and distribution. So I guess I'm gonna start with you, Noni, just to kind of throw a specific question out there. To what extent do you see the shortage as a precondition for the access and distribution issues? And if you don't, how could one resolve the questions of access and distribution you raise without solving the underlying shortage amidst capitalism operating, at least in some parts of the community we live in?
Yeah. Well, I think there are many routes into that, where we're starting in EBPREC is really prioritizing ownership, which spreads equity, which spreads skill sets and knowledge to sort of leverage into more ownership. But if we're speaking sort of on a generalized level, given that we're piloting something that's going to take some time to scale out, although it already is in some senses, you know, I think it's a whole economy question, right? I don't think that we can just focus in on getting the units built, like solving shortage to solve the access and distribution question. It's almost in the sense of, I don't want to say creating a market, but we have to be able to expand, if you will, if you want to speak in economic terms, we have to be able to expand the customer base who has the income to access both what is presently available and what may be produced. First of all, there's number one, there's multiple levels that I think on, we're attempting to think on this, right? And so for that, we know that there has to be an expansion of access to the trades. It's still very difficult for Black and Brown people to get access to the building trades, to get access to the construction trades, right? Which can be very lucrative and really can provide a salary. We know that our essential workers, such as our police officers, our teachers, they're underpaid, right? So they have challenges accessing what's currently present, and especially so for new things that are being built, right? There's always resistance to bringing people up to a living wage. We've had to literally have, quote unquote, the fight for 15, when actually 15 for the rents in the Bay Area are not a living wage. With our little tiny shoestring budget, we're paying 33 at entry level, but we've also learned that actually a living wage is $38 an hour, right? A police officer to afford market rate rent in Oakland right now, he'd have to work, I think, 106 hours a week. He'd still be rent burdened, she'd still be rent burdened, right? So that's one issue around access, is actually regarding our folks who live and work and serve in Oakland as essential enough to be paid a wage that would allow them to live in the city they live and serve in. So this is what I mean by a whole economy issue, right? We have to be thinking about relationships with junior colleges, relationships with trade schools, and demanding that the unions have equitable access, that the port has equitable access, that our schools are thinking about fee routes, right? And one of the challenges with the really great political engagement of folks like YIMBY is their demographic actually is of a demographic that actually doesn't attend to the populations that still need to be educated, right? Most of you guys are running between 30 and 45 and are childless. There's a large segment that are childless. So the focus on the issue is not thinking about the pipeline, and it's often not even feeling empowered enough to engage in building up economic opportunity for the standing population who live and serve and in many ways populate Oakland but have to drive in. Another issue is around the so-called costs of construction. So when you're trying to discuss with developers this problem of having to not only build market rate, but build at a rate that is really out of scope with the market in many ways, the response is often that the numbers don't pencil out. The numbers don't pencil out if you front load 22% profit. The numbers don't pencil out for various reasons that could be mitigated if we didn't presume and valorize that the claims that come from profiteers and market actors take precedent over equations and numerical calculations you could undertake to cause a new site development to pencil out. Okay, so again, that's about taking the burden off of those who are extracting the most from our infrastructure and from our public resources, and giving the least back. And it also is dependent on our leaders, our city leaders, advocating for us in a way that, again, doesn't continue to prioritize the market over other calculations. If you want to take like the B Corp framework of people, planet, and profit, those numbers work out differently for long-term costs. Around 2013, Alameda County Health Department declared a public health emergency in relationship to this so-called housing shortage. So then you do the mathematics of costs for health outcomes, for mental health outcomes, for having to have intercession from our law enforcement instead of like social services or community services. Like the costs actually don't pencil out in that way either. And then there's this question of like policy, because someone asked in the Q&A if we could, I think they said, I clicked, I wanted to answer it, like, is
you mind if we get to that question
solution for tech? Oh, do you want me to not address it?
Yeah, just we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Do you mind if we just?
Oh, okay. Oh, it's an interesting question around income. Right. And so then I guess I'll sort of close up. And so the other issue is about policy. And our policy continues to sort of under our policy work often sort of is not necessarily visionary policy work. Right? You look at places, certain districts, they are really causing folks who are holding back resources from the market speculatively. They're disincentivizing that, right? But that means that you're not privileging those who have more than those who are living here and working and serving. So our policy work needs to get more aggressive and more visionary. And often there's this sort of idea that we wanting to expand the tax base of Oakland, there's this resistance to then often stabilizing the most underserved of us with this sense of we'll become like, if you will, with such a not unnecessarily derisive term, a welfare city, right? A city that is driven on public benefit instead of an expansion of a base. But if part of your policy work is around building the access to resources for those most underserved, then they can join in on the market like the rest of us, and potentially actually even out the market forces when they have more buying power as renters and potentially buyers. So it's the question I'm asking is thinking about all of the interventions have to be more holistic and stop working just for a smaller segment and stop sort of being myopic around how you have to build a whole economy to support a market and not just input one element into the economy, because that keeps things off balance. No matter how many inputs you put in that one place, it will still throw off the other dynamics, and you have to be thinking of the whole dynamic.
Thank you, Noni. Catherine, I wanted to come to you real quick because I know in addition to housing, sort of the workforce is the other key piece of kind of tech equity is no work there. So could you talk about kind of where's the overlap and sort of the advocacy you all do there, and to the extent it kind of correlates to the race conversation, and to pick up there?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of two sides of the same coin, right? And to Noni's point about Fight for 15, you know, it feels, and this is labor, we work with Silicon Valley Rising and Working Partnerships USA on a lot of our workforce stuff, and they have recently gotten more involved in housing conversations because they realize that every win they've gotten on contracts or pay or whatever just gets eaten up by housing costs. So, you know, you got to work on both at the same time. And, you know, lowering the cost of housing is effectively putting more money in the pocket of workers. So, you know, you can't really separate the two conversations. And I think there's sort of a dotted line in the Venn diagram that also is transportation issues. That sits in there as well. So, I mean, I think I saw one question in the Q&A about what is what is tech's responsibility here on the housing side, given that they're creating vast majority, but they're creating a huge proportion of the jobs in the Bay Area, which has no question exacerbated the affordability crisis. Though I will say, this is what happens when a sector booms, any sector booms, on top of a structure that is as broken as the structure is in California. So, I don't think it's totally fair to just say tech is the cause of this problem. And it's not fair. It's also dangerous because I think it's a misdiagnosis. It leads you to solutions that say, well, tech should just leave. That's not going to solve the housing crisis. So, and it's going to hurt the economy. So, I mean, it's sort of we need to be clear about tech's role in this and responsibility. And I think that, this question of jobs, housing balance is a really important one. And I think when Cupertino builds something like the new Apple campus, which is, I think, 20,000 headcount office space, the equivalent of, a Manhattan skyscraper in the middle of Cupertino, and the city actively says no to building any housing, that isn't really, what is Apple supposed to do at that point, right? Like, Apple can't build the housing if Cupertino isn't going to allow them to build the housing. I also think, it is a lot of people are pushing on the tech companies to do more. They have now made significant commitments totaling $4.5 billion, a little bit more than that. And it's a drop in the bucket. And so I think it's both, not going to hit the scale that we need to ask tech to solve this problem for us, or business in general, but also it's a dereliction of your democratic duty to, put the onus on Mark Zuckerberg or Tim Cook, who nobody elected anything, and not put the onus of responsibility on elected officials and us, who are the citizens of this place and need to demand different. So yes, they should be at the table. Yes, they should support housing. Yes, they have an interest in making sure that it is affordable to live here. But if we're putting all our chips on the tech community to solve this problem for us, then we're going to be very disappointed with the outcome. And I saw another question in the Q&A about, if what's driving up costs, the cost of housing, is that tech workers get paid enough that they can afford to pay the rents that are being demanded, then how do we reduce tech salaries? And I think that that's the wrong way around. I mean, the way to reduce tech salaries is to make housing more affordable. I promise you that Facebook doesn't want to pay the salaries they have to pay in order to attract talent. And tech companies should also be doing more to tap into, talent pools that are already here. We're working with Square. They are now the residents of the building across the street from my apartment. We have been working with them closely to tap into local Oakland talent as they start hiring for the work in that building, which is now not happening. But hopefully when we're on our path to recovery, that we can revisit those conversations. But that is part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. And we really need to, this is why we are focused on making sure that people who work in tech, who have an immense amount of political power, are in these fights to push public policy that we think will make the structural changes we need for any industry to boom and for it to benefit everybody.
I think if I can pivot, this sort of question of like who's to blame is sort of important, and also sometimes we can get bogged down in it and sort of it can stop us from finding the solutions. But to spend just a little bit of time on who's to blame in the like Cupertino narrative, because so about a year before he became the mayor of Cupertino, I was at a hearing debating whether Cupertino was going to allow some housing. And this sort of prominent person said to me that outside of this hearing, that the real problem in his eyes was that renters were trying to get into the school district and not making a real commitment in Cupertino, that they weren't buying a home and they they didn't intend to live there, and it was really a problem for the school district. And there were, Noni, I could see you just, it's like I was so, the levels at which I lost it, right, were kind of, I was just like, and then he just walked away, and I was like, like so many levels. And it also, then I'm thinking like, okay, this is a former executive white guy who lives in Cupertino who's housing secure. And there's all kinds of levels to the ways in which that informs his exclusionary perspective. And there's also ways in which, Ernest telling his story of his family, like we're all individuals, and we're also then sometimes representative of different big narratives in American life. And, the ways in which his family history, I'm sure, had a huge influence on his capacity to think of renters as a substantively different kind of people than homeowners. It was so fascinating to me. And it's also fascinating that, so my family, my great-great-grandfather was able to buy a house. My grandparents were all able to buy houses. My parents and every single one of my aunts and uncles were able to buy houses, multiple houses in many cases. And, now that my generation, which has decades, generations of the government making sure that my white family got more benefits than other kinds of families and got access to housing security, the fact that we have this overriding shortage means that none of my generation is able to buy a house right now, except in places that have less jobs. And while that's like not that sad a story, right? Like, oh, boo-hoo, right? This generation of white kids can't afford to buy houses and is putting off having kids. It does mean that there's this empathy opening there in a way that I think if we're doing our politics well, we can capitalize on, that we can really say that like, when a system is broken for more than a certain segment of a population, it gives you this ability to use that to create a wider social change that, if we do it right, means that we can make sure that we do it equitably and bring everybody up. I don't know if we're going to harness that up. It's everybody on this call, right? We're like here wanting to make sure that we use that opportunity, but it also means that like there's so much work to be done. It's like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Building that political will that we can say, because this is such a deep and systemic problem, it's going to need a multi-pronged solution. And how can we figure out how to say yes to each other's solutions in order to have a coalition that can pass? It's literally, it's a package of bills that we need to pass over and over again in order to deal with these problems. We need to pass the strong tenants protections along with the production, along with the affordable housing funding, along with more interesting ways of thinking about home ownership. All of these things are going to need to be packaged together, because right now what we have, and this is, having PTSD from the last legislative season, like we all have the ability to kill each other's bills, right? And it's like, letting one solution be the enemy of other solutions is what has kept us from being able to solve this problem over the past, 10 years, 15 years, and the sort of medium to short term. Is labor's ability to kill a bill has meant that nobody gets a real solution. And then you've got, the market only people have the ability to kill the tenants protections. And this is all of these things. Unless we're able to say, how do we all then not kill each other's bills and pass a whole package that we can all see as benefiting a broader group of people? I do think that we're getting closer. We're closer than we were 5 years ago. So that's, a little bit exciting.
Gloria, I wanted to kind of end this piece of it with you, to something kind of Laura sort of alluded to, there's a possibility of this because now we're all sort of struggling a little bit more, at least particularly in my generation, is there an opportunity to sort of like realize, well, these people have been struggling for like generations. and there's some connection there. I guess, I see it through the YIMBY movement, but like, do you see much of that from your vantage point of EBHO as like new people who seem interested in their self-interest in this cause? and then sort of know what do you think that needs to mean from like, how the policy apparatus needs to change now that this is no longer simply a housing crisis that is affecting sort of those modest income. Now it's climbing up the income ladder to who is suffering this here in the Bay Area from a housing standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that we do see that moment, and I think it's why, Laura talks about how we can kill each other's bills, and that's certainly true. And maybe we'll have time to get to one of the very first questions that was posted, which is like, what does an equitable upzoning bill look like? Not so subtle allusion to SB 50 and a lot of other, and efforts to do some sort of effective upzoning. And we've learned that we can kill each other's stuff, although so can exclusionary NIMBYs, who are probably most of what have killed production-based bills. But we can also win each other's stuff. And I wanted the one example that I love so much was the signing ceremony for AB 1482. So for those who don't know, that's Assembly Bill 1482. It passed in the last legislative session, and it established a rent cap statewide, as well as what's called statewide just cause for eviction, which is, I always say, all that means is you can't evict someone just cause. Means you have to have a reason to evict somebody other than you just want to make more money off of their apartment. So I say, if you're a responsible landlord, a just cause eviction policy should be nothing for you to fear. So we passed a statewide bill, and in that signing ceremony in Oakland, Gavin Newsom was there, but every single housing, like people who frankly, sometimes don't even speak to each other, and I don't know if they were speaking to each other or not, but some of them were, they were even hugging. And
it froze.
And, Catherine, I think you were there, like the folks were there. So, am I freezing? Okay, good. Okay, so that's an example of what we need to head to. And I do think we see glimmers of that, and we see the political momentum. And better and worse, we see the political momentum because, as several of you have mentioned, it's gotten so bad that people who never thought they would be hurting are hurting, which is always the way in public policy, right? As long as it's mostly poor people, or formerly incarcerated people, or Black and brown people, or people with disabilities who are hurting, does it become a public policy priority? It usually does not. And once it's, as Laura said, I mean,
Laura, you're gonna have to make that point again, because I'm sure it's good.
Her background looks great, though.
This is why you got to invest in a good background.
Yeah.
While we wait for Gloria's computer to catch up with her brilliance, my other panelists, so a lot of the questions in the Q&A are more sort of like policy-focused questions. So like the people want to know, what do we think about different policy solutions? So Gloria was beginning to speak to that question, and I'll let her finish her comments. How that looks like she's back. But no, the question that she spoke to assumed that like equitable and just upzoning is like what is needed. I don't want to presume that if it's not upzoning, if it's equitable and just something else, feel free to say so. But like, what does that look like? And I'd like you to think through, what do you need from the other people on this call to like make that come into being? So let's start with Catherine.
Well, I feel like a little bit, I'm just going to pick my favorite policy to beat up on or to propose, which is Prop 13 reform. I think it is one of the, if not the biggest structural crack in California's foundation. And it is, I think one of those, for those who don't know, I'm sure everybody who comes to a housing talk on a Saturday afternoon knows what Prop 13 is, but quickly, ballot initiative passed in the late 70s, pegs the property taxes you pay to the value of the property when you purchased it, never goes up. It is obviously extremely aggressive and benefits people who have been in for a long time at the expense of people who are trying to come into the market. It crucially also covers not just residential property, but also commercial and industrial property, which creates all kinds of inequities that affect the economy. So we really need to tackle that, and we haven't. It's been, the third rail of California politics forever, since it passed, and I don't know that there's a way that we get at the, Noni made a good point about thinking about this whole, the policy solution set as being very holistic, and you really need to look at the economy overall. We're making housing policy on top of a broken foundation, to really stretch that housing metaphor. And if we don't focus on fixing that structural problem, inequity will persist. And so, there will be a ballot initiative on the ballot in November to reform the corporate side, so removing protections for commercial owners of property, or owners of commercial property. I think I'm really interested, and this is not on the agenda currently, but I think it should be, and I think speaks to Noni's point about, corporate ownership of residential property. I think as we look at how we address the residential inequities of Prop 13, how about going after these corporate owners of residential property who are not paying property tax? I mean, I think it's totally, disgusting that, a hedge fund, Blackstone or whoever owns all these single family homes and is getting a property tax break that was sold to the California voting public as something that was going to help, grandma on a fixed income not lose her home to rising property taxes. So that's something I would love to see us start to address as well. And I'll let the others speak to their favorite policy solutions as well.
Gloria, do you want to hop in? So you were speaking before your internet cut out.
Sure. Sorry, everybody. I don't know what happened. So much for upgrading our internet recently.
Well, that back is heavy. It's using a lot of gigs.
Yeah. So the question is basically like, what intentional policies are we trying to get forward now?
Right. The question in the chat was about kind of just and equitable upzoning. I don't want to assume that it has to be upzoning specifically. I mean, it can be a lot of other things, right? But what does that just equitable policy set need to include? Maybe 1 or 2 items that are sort of key in your mind.
Sure. I mean, I do think we need some just and equitable production policies that might include upzoning in some places, but what makes it just and equitable is some degree of adjustment for different kinds of communities. The market does not need help along International Boulevard in Oakland. Well, I'm sorry, I'm speaking as if it's February. A lot of anything I say about the market is now, let's just consider it all blown up, right? We don't know. But 3 months ago, the market didn't need help by having increased people being able to build taller buildings along International Boulevard. But absolutely things needed to happen in places in Contra Costa that have a BART station where you're still building single family homes right around a BART station. So I do think there is a need for that. And in addition to, of course, just production policies, I think, a lot of the questions in the chat and that have come up in the Q&A are about, like, we keep saying intentional about racial justice. What do we mean by that from a policy and practice perspective? It's really tough because we now have laws that say you can't make laws based on people's color, race, etc., which is a good thing. It does sometimes create a tension between, like, a fair housing law saying you actually can't build affordable housing and say it's only for people who have, who we determine to be most in need or most impacted, right? But what you can do is practices. You have to make sure, if you're building affordable housing, for example, are you marketing it as well as possible to all of the different populations that may need to get that access? If you have new tenant protections like 1482, or most recently, we have all of these eviction moratoria that were passed, really absolutely critical in COVID-19. I am terrified that people are so confused if they even know about these policies at all. And just to put it shortly, you can't get physically evicted right now. You do still need to pay your rent. Like, if I had to summarize what most of those policies actually mean, and are those policies being articulated in a way that people understand and in language? Because if you're not getting that information, you might either think your landlord's allowed to evict you, or you might think you just don't have to pay your rent without consequences for the next 3 months. Neither of those things are true. So there needs to be equitable outreach. And then finally, I would say we need a raft of policies that do target certain populations that tend to have overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I'm always really careful not to conflate low-income people and people of color, because that's where racist myths come from, right? But policies that prohibit discrimination against Section 8 holders from renting, that's a really good one. Policies that open up affordable housing and housing in general to people with histories of incarceration. Policies that support undocumented people. So those are a few examples.
You want to go, Laura, and then we'll end with Noni on this question?
Sure. I mean, Prop 13, perennial, and a lot of the ways in which, I think there's a lot of rhetoric around, oh, we shouldn't treat housing as an investment, but what do we really mean by that, right? And what are the laws that actually cause both people and corporations to treat housing as something that they are investing in rather than something that they're living in and using, and more like a product that you use, which is a really different way. You know, it shouldn't necessarily be something that you expect to outperform the market decade after decade, right? This is a different way of thinking about it. And when we have programs like Prop 13 and the mortgage interest tax deduction that are designed to make it more desirable to own a home and benefit existing homeowners, all of those policies disproportionately help white people, disproportionately help people with more family wealth. And it's really hard to then say, how do we expand home ownership, but also make it do less? Because if we make it perform, we're going to continue to see BlackRock investing in it and then not actually using it as housing. Those are complicated issues of taxation and incentives. So yes, to reforming Prop 13. I also think that we need, you know, the big policies of adding a lot more housing and exclusionary communities. So that's going to be upzoning, but also thinking about how the way in which we make project by project decisions about individual housing, how does that, as we reform that process, it's really important to kind of look at, like, okay, let's look at all of California. When you have a project by project decision making process, a Noe Valley in San Francisco. There's more retired lawyers in Noe Valley than any other neighborhood in San Francisco. They are able to use, I don't know that for a fact, but I definitely think it's true. They're able to use a complicated process to shut down everything from like a neighbor trying to build a little ADU to, heaven forbid, somebody propose a big honkin' subsidized affordable mixed income community in that neighborhood. They are able to use a messed up process to shut it down. The mission uses that same process in order to get community benefits that benefit the existing stakeholders. And how do we, if we're going to say we're going to fix project by project decision making, how do we make sure that those communities that are currently using a messed up process to get community services in neighborhoods that have been previously disinvested in, that is going to happen at the same time. Like, we've done some process improvement bills that I think didn't fully address the fact that low-income disinvested in communities are going to need direct investment as we fix the process of entitling housing. And those two things, I think, haven't been tied together as explicitly as they're going to need to be in order for us to genuinely solve that problem. Because I don't want to give the same tools. Right now, Beverly Hills and the Mission are using the same tools for very different purposes, right? And so how do we have a system where, you know, the Mission gets the services that it needs and the protections that it needs, but we're not giving Beverly Hills the ability to block, you know, every single little thing.
Go for it, Noni.
I've lost the original question. Can you restate it?
Yes. So just as we think about, I mean, and again, I think I admire what you're doing. And sort of like when we think about what does the just, equitable sort of solution set look like, I mean, you spoke to how the cooperative like is literally a piece of that. You are modeling and demonstrating at least a part of that, but is sort of like beyond the cooperative knows anything you want to highlight as, be it upzoning, be it sort of other stuff that you want to highlight as a piece of how we move forward that you want to just highlight right now.
I actually like where Laura ended in terms of all of these varied solutions that we've just briefly touched on today being paired with authentic investment in the most underserved communities. Um, and sort of not the classic understanding of investment where someone comes in with a pot of money and if there are endeavors that could promise a return on investment, then putting their money there at some interest rate that is actually not really that practical, right? I think it's a rethinking of the concept of investment. One of our people issuing a question mentioned some of the old federal where we used to be able to depend on the federal government for that kind of community investment, i.e. community reinvestment acts and such, to continue to build our community in a holistic fashion. And so I think that's the critical part of it, that for every market and political intervention that one undertakes, the thinking has to be driven by how does the work to get where I'm going, how will the outcomes result in an investment in enhancing the power of those who have the least power in this system. And often that does mean non-extractive capital infusions, not subsidized capital infusions, but knowing that we need to rebuild a broken infrastructure. However, that does require one to sort of break through this trance that folks like the person Laura Foote talked to are in, where we can tell these sort of glib stories about those we don't know who are suffering, about how they're looking to extract more and more from the system. So for me personally, but even philosophically in our work, what's really necessary is a shift in the mindset of what it is we're trying to do here, right? Like your intentions, the research question you ask will determine the answer you find yourself with, right? And so we have to rethink what our plan is. Are we trying to rebuild our cities nationally, or are we trying to consolidate power? Are we trying to support the housing of a reserve workforce for large tech giants who are putting a lot of money into the ephemeral infrastructure, but our actual brick and mortar infrastructure where our humans live and function and work? What is our intention? Where do we want to see our cities and our communities, right? And so we have to really be honest to know that if there's an intention of rebuilding, that intention is at odds, excuse me, Mr. Young Democrat, is at odds with our mainstream political parties' directions right now. Both the Republicans and the Democrats are moving in a direction that continues to disempower the worker, that continues to disempower the most underserved. And so we can't go along and use and portend as if our political work, as if our economic work, that we're all aligned and headed to the same place. We need to be clear about where we're aligned and headed, and need to be authentic, honest, and courageous around drawing our attention and our eyes toward those who are not aligned toward that outcome. Most of our leadership is not fully aligned toward that outcome. Often rhetorically, folks who call themselves progressives, but we have to really clearly define for ourselves what are we progressing toward? What are our authentic intentions? And so that's what I would leave you with in terms of the intention around how we enact our structural and infrastructural transformations that we're trying to collectively imagine here.
Thank you, Nani. All right, so we are getting close to time. So the last question I want to end us with, and try to keep about 2 minutes each, and we'll stay on time. We're going to start with you, Laura. how do you imagine as we move forward, both kind of influenced by, again, this moment of sort of crisis, seeing how we all get to see right now how fractured the foundation is to Catherine's metaphor in our system. Now more than ever, it is clear this is broken. It is not serving many, many people. But how do you see possibilities, and specific to the groups that we have here on this call, to kind of work better together as we move forward to build something better, building that stronger foundation? And what are the opportunities there that you hope to be able to sort of come through on as we move forward in the next couple of months and years? You're muted, Lauren.
Sorry, yeah. One thing that I hope, out of this crisis we will see is people not focusing on, I'm sure on this call, right? And all the time in politics, you hear somebody and you hear one thing you like and you hear one thing you don't like, or you hear 10 things you don't like, you hear one thing you do like. And I hope that to some degree, in a crisis, we all kind of have this big idea, we all want to come together. And I hope that it's going to make us better at hearing the one thing we did like and saying, okay, I'm going to work with you on the one thing I heard you say that you and I agree about already. And maybe I'll fight you on the 10 other things, but at least, today it's Saturday and I'm going to work with you on the thing I heard you say that I like. And so maybe we can get that one across the finish line, because I think we have all seen too many people waste too much time focusing on how do I defeat the thing that I don't like, rather than how do I build the thing that we could have had, and we could have been seeing, huge investment in affordable housing, right? That is something that everybody on this call agrees we need to do. We need dramatically more funding. And I do think that that's the kind of thing that if we can hear, I know everybody here agrees with that. I think we're going to have to go figure out new pots of money, because the state government's broke, the federal government's being stingy, and local governments are broke. And that's something that everybody's going to have to put down their preconceptions about what do other people think and say, at least I know you're desperate to get more funding for affordable housing. So we're going to go figure that one out together. I think there are a lot of points like that we're going to be able to find more and more agreement. And I would even say, even in the most exclusionary NIMBY suburbs, because we're going to be able to make arguments that are going to be new in the new economy, where local governments are broke. Okay, great. So now them legalizing building housing in those communities is going to be a cheap way for them to build up their local economy. And so you're going to see, and potentially one of my pet issues that I would love to see more of is cities joining and incorporating, so that we start to see, because we need more regional decision making. If we see little cities and towns getting broke enough, they're going to start merging. And in fact, that's going to be better for everybody. And if we can create incentives for communities that, each have really exclusionary school districts, suddenly getting together, legalizing, building a bunch of housing, and taking steps to make long-term systemic changes, if we can agree that a new deal in housing is what's going to help get us out of this recession, those are the kinds of things that I think are possible out of this crisis.
All right. Go for it, Noni.
Restate the question, please.
All the time. Just, again, particularly to the other people we have here, the other panelists call, what are opportunities you see for collaboration in the kind of the spirit Laura was alluding to, coming out of this moment where we're all seeing how broken the system we're in is, and I agree with Laura's position, we need to find better ways to sort of collaborating. So do you see any particular opportunities for that collaboration, I guess, specifically with the other folks here on this call, if not more generally?
Yeah, I find it interesting how everyone reacted when Laura suggested cities sort of collaborating and combining. I was wondering the hilarity of that. This is interesting. I was talking to an organizer friend yesterday who thought that was a better solution, that making regional decisions among cities instead of separately. And in my little comment here to the panelists, I wish I could have yelled it or written it in all caps: cooperation, not competition. Competition is what keeps us confused and separate. And competition is a principle of the capitalist market of production as we currently live underneath it. Healthy economies are not competitive economies. Healthy economies are cooperative economies, where we each find our niche and we share and exchange our work and our labor and our space and our time on the basis of mutual benefit, right? And so again, although we're piloting a model of cooperation, not competition, what is the required change is a change in our mindset. You can retain certain versions of capitalist production that are not predicated on competition, that are not predicated on extractive labor, right? But you have to make some big choices. The expectations we've had for the percentage of growth of the economy since we've kicked this whole project off called America have been unreasonable. I understand they were meant for rapid industrialization and rapid technological advance, but we've made such an advance now, we could make a choice now to pace ourselves, right? And we know that those kinds of social transformations that at some point you see surface inside of policy and law and social convention start locally, individually with each of our choices. Because I'm sure that everybody on this panel at some point now or in the next 10 years will be in a place of extreme power. And we can each make a choice on how we guide those organizations that will be over, and what will we choose at that point? How will we choose to deploy our resources? How will we choose to develop the leadership that comes after us? Those who support us and our PAs and our project managers, what will we tell them about our vision for the work that we're putting out there on the ground? So I still challenge each of you to do the work differently in each of your fields without hopelessness, despite being surrounded by the hopeless, and knowing that we can retune our work one action at a time while being verbal and out loud and courageous about the need to shift our mindset so that our material outcome begins to match those.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, and so, I mean, we have the word collaborative in our name, so I think everything we try to do is done in that spirit. So it's hard to pick on one thing, but one thing we didn't talk about that I think is going to be really critical to accomplishing any of the things we all know we need to do to get to a place where everybody who wants to live here can afford to live here is to elect people to public office who share that view. And I think I've learned the hard way over the last couple of years, getting engaged in policy fights in Sacramento, that there is a power imbalance there, that there are vested interests, both NIMBYs and realtors and landlords and all of these interests who have to do very little to shut down a conversation about pro-housing policies. And it all happens before anybody even has to take a vote. And so we need to change that dynamic. And that means that we need to build power on the electoral side. And I take some responsibility for this too, but I feel like too often in the housing advocacy community, we stop at policy advocacy and we sort of stay away from the candidate campaigns. And we can't do that if we want to actually get those policies over the finish line, because there is a real hard ceiling on what we're able to accomplish in California and certainly in the Bay Area without different people in positions to make those decisions. So hopefully that's something I'm working on, some of that stuff with in the South Bay and those districts that Laura mentioned. I think the suburbs are really, there's some purple districts in California, there's some purple districts in the Bay Area. I think that they're very ripe for change. And I'm looking forward to collaborating with a wide spectrum of pro-housing advocates on taking some political power in those places.
Gloria.
Thanks. I'll try to close this out quickly. So yeah, I heard lots of what I like and what everybody had to say. And I think the opportunity, Ernest, is it's not like we ever really had the luxury of wasted energy, but we really don't now. And so I'm kind of overplaying at the margins, and especially if it's just for the purposes of performative debates. And Laura talked about really messed up public processes. And I unfortunately, after grad school, I had the experience of trying to get into neighborhood activism, and I chose a neighborhood in Oakland that was having a fight over, in North Oakland, tearing down an old Safeway to build a newer, nicer Safeway. And people lost their minds because the design for the new Safeway was too Tuscan, but our neighborhood is craftsman. And I was just like, what? I mean, that's not a housing example. You're laughing, but right? It's like ridiculous, but it's also like terrible, because that's what I mean by wasted energy. And to take a more serious example, you know, there's a really legit debate in Berkeley right now about, hey, in impacted communities, do we allow developers to pay a fee to build affordable housing at a deep level somewhere in the city, build it on site in that same building, to have economic integration in that same building? There are really legit policy debates on both sides. However, the energy that's going into something in this COVID-19 economic market, when frankly, almost nothing market is probably going to get built for many years, I'm like, we got to think way bigger. The people who are pushing for innovation are going to push even harder. The people who are pushing for traditional ways to produce housing are going to push to use systems that exist to do things at scale. I don't think either of those approaches are wrong, but we have to scale up what we're thinking. And so I'll just leave it with like the two interventions I want to see, at least one of which has already been mentioned today. Number one, on the regional collaboration, which I laughed, Noni, because small cities hate anything regional, but there is hopefully going to be a regional ballot measure on the ballot this November to create a Bay Area Housing Finance Agency and region-wide housing funding. If we could get that passed, that would be a big deal. And second, Catherine said it, Prop 13 reform, schools and communities first. Everybody on this call can probably get behind that in terms of redistribution. So those are my pitches.
Cool. So the last thing I want to say, one, thank you all the attendees for joining us today. I know an hour and a half of your Saturday is not insignificant, but I hope you learned something from all of our panelists today. And I believe all of you run membership organizations. So if you liked what you heard from someone you hadn't heard before, please check out the organization and join as a member. I am just about all of them, and it's been wonderful being part of all of them. And one in particular, again, this is part of Affordable Housing Week. Gloria, you want to tell us about what other events are coming up as part of EBHO's Affordable Housing Week?
Just to say, check out ebho.org. We have a list of a couple of other events, including one on extremely low income housing and homelessness that'll focus more on that next week. And just look at our website. There's a lot of other, there's a few other panels, podcasts, some of which you can tune into anytime that'll be taking place. Oh yeah, and my associate Grover just plugged that into the chat.
There we go. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And again, check out all these great organizations that I personally believe they are all pushing this boulder up a hill that we need to sort of solve this nation's centuries of housing injustice. And I think they could all use a little more support getting it up the hill. So thank you all. Have a good evening.
Yeah.
That was so great, Ernest. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Yes, and also we're going to make the recording available afterwards. So whether you attended today or not, you'll get an email follow-up. I'll include some of the links and links to all of the organizations, and so you can share this panel discussion with other people as well.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura.
Bye.
Safeway.
I shop there.